What if everything you thought you knew about how the gospel reached Germany was incomplete? Before institutions, before organized religion, before massive churches dominated the land, there was something far more powerful spreading quietly. Not through systems, but through people. And what started as a whisper would become a movement that shook the world. But here's the part most people don't realize. Germany wasn't waiting for the gospel. It was a land deeply rooted in ancient beliefs, rituals, and traditions that defined every aspect of life. Gods of nature, war, and fate shaped decisions, fears, and identity. So how does a message like Christ's enter a world like that? And more importantly, how does it survive? At first, it didn't look like a revolution. No armies, no political power, no massive influence, just individuals carrying a message that challenged everything people believed about life, purpose, and eternity. A message that didn't just ask for attention, it demanded transformation. And that's where things began to change. But the journey wasn't smooth. There were tensions, resistance, moments where it seemed like the message would disappear completely. And yet, somehow, it kept moving forward, crossing borders, cultures, and generations, growing stronger in the most unexpected ways. And then, something happened. A turning point so powerful that it didn't just impact Germany, it reshaped the entire course of history. But before we get there, you need to understand how it all began. Because the beginning holds the key to everything that comes next. Subscribe. Because this story is just beginning. Before the gospel ever reached Germany, this land was not a nation, but a collection of tribes deeply connected to nature, survival, and spiritual forces they could not see, but fully believed in. Forests were not just landscapes, they were sacred spaces. Storms were not just weather, they were signs. Every part of life carried a spiritual meaning, and every decision was shaped by traditions passed down through generations. Into this world, something unexpected began to enter. Not through conquest or political power, but through movement. Quiet, almost unnoticed at first. Traders traveling across regions, soldiers moving along borders, and early believers carrying with them a message that didn't belong to any empire. It wasn't loud, but it was different enough to be remembered. The gospel didn't arrive as a system. It came as a story about one God, about sacrifice, about redemption, ideas that didn't fit into the existing beliefs of the Germanic tribes. And because of that, it didn't spread instantly. It lingered. It stayed in conversations, in encounters, in moments where curiosity overcame resistance. Some of the earliest influences came from contact with the Roman world, where Christianity had already begun to grow. Even though much of Germania stood outside direct Roman control, the borders became channels of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas. And through those fragile connections, the message of Christ slowly began to cross into unfamiliar territory. Then came those who chose to carry this message further. Missionaries who stepped into unknown lands, not with certainty of success, but with conviction. One of the most known among them was Boniface, a man who didn't just speak about faith, but demonstrated it through bold actions that challenged deeply rooted beliefs. His presence marked a shift, not immediate, but undeniable. But spreading a message is only the first step, because hearing something new is very different from accepting it. And as the gospel began to move deeper into these lands, it would soon face something much stronger than distance or language. It would face belief itself, and that's where the real story begins. But what happens when a completely new belief enters a world that already feels complete? In the Germanic lands, spirituality wasn't just a part of life. It was everything. The people believed their gods controlled nature, war, destiny, and even the smallest details of daily survival. Every ritual had meaning, every symbol carried weight, and every decision was influenced by unseen forces they deeply respected and feared. So when the message of the gospel arrived, it didn't just sound different, it sounded disruptive. The idea of one God above all others, a God not bound to nature but sovereign over it, challenged the very foundation of their worldview. It wasn't simply a new belief being added. It was a truth that replaced everything they thought they understood about life, power, and purpose. And this is where tension began to rise. Some listened out of curiosity, others out of desperation, and many with resistance. Because accepting this message didn't just mean changing what they believed. It meant letting go of traditions passed down through generations. It meant questioning rituals, redefining identity, and stepping into something completely unknown. But even in the middle of resistance, something unexpected started to happen. There were individuals who felt that this message answered questions their old beliefs never could. Questions about suffering, forgiveness, purpose, and what happens beyond this life. And slowly, almost quietly, the gospel began to take root, not through force, but through conviction. There are stories of missionaries who didn't just preach, but lived among the people, learning their language, understanding their fears, and connecting truth to their reality. Instead of destroying culture, they redirected it, showing that the gospel wasn't just a foreign idea, but a truth that could transform from within. This created bridges where there could have been only conflict. But don't mistake this for an easy transition. The clash between old beliefs and the message of Christ didn't disappear overnight. It created internal struggles, divided communities, and forced people to make decisions that would change the course of their lives. And just when it seemed like the message was beginning to settle, something even bigger was about to happen. But what happens when a message that once changed everything becomes buried over time? As centuries passed, the gospel was no longer spreading the same way it once did. What started as a living, transformative message began to be surrounded by structures, traditions, and systems that slowly shifted the focus away from its original simplicity. And for many, faith became more about obligation than conviction. Then, in the middle of that silence, something unexpected began to rise. Not from kings, not from powerful institutions, but from a growing discomfort, a sense that something wasn't right. People began to question, to read, to search, and among them was a man who would unknowingly become one of the most important figures in this entire story. Martin Luther didn't set out to start a movement. He wasn't trying to create division or reshape history. He was searching for truth. But what he discovered in Scripture confronted everything he had been taught. The idea that salvation was not something to be earned, bought, or mediated through systems, but received by faith, was not just different. It was revolutionary. And when that truth was made public, everything changed. His writings spread faster than anyone could have imagined, amplified by something new at the time: the printing press. Suddenly, ideas that were once controlled and limited were now accessible. People could read, think, and question for themselves, and the gospel, centered on Scripture, began to move again with power. But this wasn't just a theological shift. It was a cultural earthquake. Authority was challenged, systems were shaken, and the tension between truth and tradition reached a breaking point. For many, this was freedom. For others, it was dangerous. And for Germany, it marked the beginning of a transformation that would never be reversed. And here's the part most people don't see. The Reformation wasn't just about doctrine. It was about access. Access to truth, to Scripture, and to a personal understanding of faith. What had once been distant became personal. What had once been controlled became alive again. And from this moment forward, the impact would go far beyond Germany. But this was only the first step. The trail goes deeper. What happens after a message survives resistance, challenges systems, and reshapes how people see truth? It doesn't just disappear. It leaves a mark. And in Germany, that mark became something far greater than a moment in history. It became a legacy that would influence generations, culture, and even the direction of the world beyond its borders. After the Reformation, the gospel was no longer distant or controlled in the same way. It became accessible. People could read Scripture in their own language, understand it for themselves, and build a personal connection with their faith. This shift didn't just change churches. It changed homes, communities, and the way individuals saw their purpose in everyday life. Education began to grow as a direct result of this transformation. The desire for people to read and understand Scripture led to increased literacy, the spread of knowledge, and the development of schools and institutions. What started as a spiritual movement began to shape intellectual and cultural progress, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond religion. But the impact wasn't always simple or easy. Change on this scale never is. There were divisions, tensions, and moments where the cost of transformation felt heavy. Yet even in the middle of that complexity, the message itself continued to move forward, carried not by perfection, but by conviction and persistence. And then something even bigger happened. Germany didn't just receive the gospel, it became a place from which the message would go out to the world. Missionaries, thinkers, and movements began to emerge, taking what had once arrived quietly and now sending it across continents, influencing nations far beyond Europe. So when we look at Germany today, we're not just looking at a country shaped by history, we're looking at a turning point, a place where a message once whispered became something that echoed across the world. What started as a quiet message carried by a few individuals became something that would reshape an entire nation. From the first encounters in tribal lands, to the tension between belief systems, to the powerful shift of the Reformation, every step played a role in something much bigger than anyone could have imagined at the time. Germany wasn't transformed overnight. It was a process marked by questions, resistance, discovery, and change. But through it all, one thing remained consistent: the persistence of a message that refused to disappear. A message that moved through people, across generations, and beyond borders, continuing even when circumstances made it difficult. And maybe that's the most powerful part of this story. The gospel didn't spread because it was easy. It spread because it answered something deeper, something human, something universal. It reached people where they were, challenged them, and invited them into something greater than themselves. But this isn't just history, because the same question still exists today. What happens when truth reaches a place that isn't expecting it? What happens when someone hears something that challenges everything they thought they knew? Just like in the past, the response still shapes the future. And the story doesn't end here. There are other nations, other moments, other journeys where the gospel moved in ways just as powerful, and sometimes even more unexpected. The trail doesn't end here. Share this story. Subscribe, because the next journey is already waiting.